You're listening to China Africa Talk.
Jambo, ni Bridget akikuletea kipindi kinachohusiana na China na Afrika.
Vous écoutez le dialogue sino-africain avec Bridget.
Everything China, everything Africa.
Olá, você está ouvindo China Africa Talk com Bridget.
سيداتي وسادتي مرحبا بكم في الحوار الصيني العربي مع بريدجيت.
Great to have you back on the program. You're listening to China Africa Talk. I'm your host, Bridget Mutambirwa, coming to you from the Chinese capital in Beijing with more discussions on what's happening with China and Africa from a Chinese and African perspective. China's concept, lucid waters and lush mountains are invaluable assets, has been a driving force behind its ecological policies for the past 2 decades. Proposed 20 years ago, the concept highlights the need to balance ecological protection with economic and social development. It has since become a cornerstone of China's environmental efforts and a key pillar of the vision of a beautiful China.
And China has become the global leader in installed capacities of hydropower, wind power, and solar power.
By embedding this vision into policy and practice, China has demonstrated its global relevance, contributing significantly to the worldwide green transition, including in Africa.
There is actually a Chinese Africa Environmental Cooperation Center that is actually domiciled at Nairobi. They work very closely with UNEP. I think this will hold a very good position for the China-African Environmental Cooperation.
As lucid waters and lush mountains becomes a defining element of China's ecological identity, questions emerge. What role will it play in China's next stage of development, and what new opportunities can China and Africa explore together in advancing sustainable growth and environmental protection? I'm now joined by Ali Said Matano, Blue Economy Advisor to the Governor of Kisumu County and Regional Executive Director of the Africa Center for Health, Environment and Water Services in Kenya. Also joining us is Zhang Yanru, an Associate Professor from the Institute of African Studies at Zhejiang Normal University. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you too.
Professor Zhang, the concept of lucid waters and lush mountains has become a cornerstone of China's ecological vision. Now, could you walk us through its origins, evolution, and significance for China's development?
Okay, the concept of lucid waters and the lush mountains is well known as two mountains theory. And President Xi first put forth the idea that lucid water and the lush mountains are invaluable assets in his specific inspection tour to Anji County, Zhejiang Province, in August 2005, and it is colloquially well known as two mountains theory. And the mountains of green refers to the quality ecological environment and as well as its associated ecological goods. And the mountains of gold represents economic incomes and the people's well-being related income and growth level. And therefore, mountains of green and mountains of gold essentially pointed to the relationship between the environmental protection and economic development. So this is about the origins, about the evolution. Based on the framework of integrating conceptual evolution, institutional construction, and practical implementation, this evolution has 3 stages. The first is the Zhejiang origins of paradigm and local breakthroughs that from 2005 2012, and a system construction and national promotion in the development period is from 2013 to 2017, and the value transformation and the global contribution in the sublimation period is from 2018 to now. And about the significance, I think the two mountains theory has been guiding throughout China's ecological civilization and radically changing man's understanding of resources and environment, and breaking the mindset of opposing economic development and environmental conservation. And since the 19th National Congress of the CPC, the theory has been given a new meaning for a new era It has been both a strategic guidance on the new normal in economic development of China and epitome of adapting Marxism to the conditions of China for the harmonious development of mind and nature. So that is the significance. And I think this part is very important to China.
Still on you, Professor Zhang, the idea was first put into practice in Zhejiang province. Now, how has it transformed the local communities, particularly in rural areas? Perhaps let's start with that, the transformation in rural areas.
I think this concept provides the direction guideline for the development of Zhejiang province and important the guidelines for promoting ecological civilization construction in the new era. And in the past 20 years, the whole province has kept these instructions in mind to build the first ecological province in the country.
How about the challenges that arose in implementation and perhaps how they were addressed? I mean, I'd like to believe that it wasn't an easy thing to implement.
Yes. So the main challenges, I think, included pollution and the low carbon transformation problems and so on. And in order to solve these problems, Zhejiang take serious measures. And firstly, taking the 811 action at the starting point.
The 811, what is that action?
The first round 811 action means 8 rivers in Zhejiang, and 11 means 11 cities in Zhejiang. And this is the first round 811 action. And the second round 811 action, the 8 means 8 projects, and 11 means 11 policies and measures. So the first 2 rounds of 811 actions. Secondly, Zhejiang, starting from the Green Rural Revival Program, Zhejiang continues expands the path of transforming green mountains and rivers into the mountains of gold and silver, achieving the green prosperity together. This is the second measure. And the third one is forging green productivity. And the new quality productivity itself is green productivity. So Zhejiang province continue to promote the adjustment of economic structure and the transformation of development mode. So I think this is 3 steps to solve the challenges or to solve the problems.
Dr. Matano, you're joining us from Kenya. In general, are there similar concepts in Africa or in your country, in Kenya, that connect environmental protection with economic value?
Thank you, Bridget, and thank you, Professor Zhang, for that very comprehensive background that you have given. Hearing what Professor Zhang has explained, I see a lot of similarities between what is happening in Georgia and what is happening here in Africa. But just to give a context in this particular discussion, allow me to address this one in 2 perspectives. First of all, let me look at Africa per se in terms of the nexus between natural resources and environmental protection. Be honest, I think the connection between environment and natural resources is more pronounced here in Africa because most of our economic activities actually depend on natural resources.
Okay.
So the connection is very clear. For example, 60% of Africans actually depend on agriculture. And when you talk of agriculture, there are 3 key areas that you focus on. One is on soil, water, and forest. And therefore, conservation of environment really focuses on the 2. And if we have conserved soil, conserved water, and we have forest, then this would translate in boosting of both the productivity in terms of food and nutritional security. So you can see already at agricultural level, and remember, Bridget, our population, as I was indicating, is quite huge. It's about 1.6 billion. That is by 2025. So it's a huge population. And if we talk of population, I think we talk the same language with China because, of course, China also has quite a huge population. Right, yeah. Then if you look at the fisheries, for example, now, fisheries, depends on healthy rivers and lakes, and to a greater extent, oceans, because Africa has a huge portion of the ocean, and therefore they have huge shore, and therefore they depend very much on their socioeconomic, on fisheries. And therefore we must have healthy rivers. Of course, when you have healthy rivers and lake systems, then we are assured of jobs and again, of course, of the nutritional and the food security levels that I've talked about. And for example, of course, we have Lake Victoria, which supports over 50 million people, and it can only be able to do that if the environment that surrounds it, and I'm going to give that one a very good context. I will just cascade down and give a context on how now that the concept of lucid waters and lush mountains actually can be explained within the Lake Victoria Basin, where I have worked for many years. Now, if we look at forest, we depend so much on timber, as well as tourism, ecotourism, for example, for our socioeconomic survival. And therefore, if you combine just the three aspects of agriculture, fisheries, and forest, you can see really it is already indicating that there is much dependence between natural resources and environmental conservation, because all these three sectors, they can only thrive if there is some aspect of environmental conservation. Of course, I also come from the blue economy space. And this is now where the aspect of lucid water and the lush mountains actually now comes clearly. Now, and I want to talk about blue economy in the context of Lake Victoria Basin, just like Professor Zhang has actually explained. And I want to share about Lake Victoria Basin. When you talk of Lake Victoria Basin, you are talking of two ecosystems. You are talking about the water ecosystem, and you are also talking of the land. And the land really represents what we are talking about, the lush mountain. And the water really is now what we are talking about, the lucid water. So I want you to look at them from that context. Now, Lake Victoria itself, just maybe to draw a virtual picture to you and my co-panelist, Dr. Zhang, is that Lake Victoria is the second largest freshwater lake in the world. So it is actually very visible in the map. So we are not talking of a small river in the side of Africa, but we are talking about the second largest river in the world. Now, this Lake Victoria has a size of about 68,800 square kilometers, and it is surrounded by a catchment area of about 184,000 square kilometers. And this particular area has a huge population of about 5 million people. So I want you to put into context the three aspects that we are talking of lucid water that is surrounded by greenery of about 184,000 square kilometers. But inside there are about 50,000 people. Now, these 50,000 people, they are predominantly farmers, and therefore their socioeconomic activities is really dependent on the natural resources. And now, when they are utilizing these natural resources, the aspect of how they use it will actually determine the health of the lucid water. And this is very common because when we are trying to explain the connection between the lake and the mountains, that is to say the catchment areas, we use a Chinese phrase that I will not say it in Chinese because I don't know Chinese, but it says that the phase of a water body mass is actually determined by what is happening in the watershed area. So you can see that actually we are saying the phase of the lucid water is determined by the phase of the lush mountain. If the phase of the water, lucid water, is, for example, not smiling for that matter, then it means there is a problem in the lush mountain. If the water itself is smiling and it is healthy, it means also that the lush mountains are also healthy. That is the connectivity that is there. So as we approach towards management of the Lake Victoria waters, we must put into cognizance the fact that the lucidness of the waters in Lake Victoria is not determined internally in the lake, but it is determined on activities that are taking place around its catchment area, so to say the mountainous areas. If the mountainous areas is not properly managed, then it means the water is going to be polluted. There will be no space. And therefore now, based on that, Bridget and my co-host, Professor Zhang, we adopted the principle of sustainability. And remember, Lake Victoria is actually shared by three countries. That is Kenya with 6% of the lake, Tanzania with 51% of the lake, and Uganda with around 41% of the lake. And of course, shared by 5 countries. That is the Republic of Burundi, it is shared by Rwanda, it is shared by Kenya, by Tanzania, and Uganda. So all those countries around the lake. So when we are managing the Lucid waters in Lake Victoria, we must put into account that it is not just one country, but it is a resource that is shared by 3 countries, but affected by the catchment of 5 countries. Wow. And therefore, we needed to come up with a joint framework that brings the 5 countries to be able to manage this particular water sustainably. That is to say, the countries that are in the catchment areas are as important as the countries that share the lake. And therefore, how now the East African Community, which is a regional economic community body, established what is called the Sustainable Development of Lake Victoria Basin Protocol. So there is already a protocol for sustainable development of Lake Victoria. But why do we insist on the aspect of sustainability? We insist on the aspect of sustainability because the development that is taking place in the catchment of these countries must be sustainable. They must be economically viable, they must be socially inclusive, and they must also be economically friendly if we have to sustain the lucidity that we want to see in the lake. An example, if the farming in the catchment areas, because we said basically about in fact, in the Lake Victoria Basin, almost 80% of the people are farmers. If their farming method is not appropriate, it means whatever is happening in the mountain is not appropriate. And therefore, the impact, the inappropriateness of their farming in the mountains is going to affect the quality of the water in the Lake Victoria, that is the lucid water, because a lot of sediment will come from the farms, a lot of erosion will take place in the lake. But if the opposite is the same, that the catchment area is managed sustainably, they use sustainable farming methods, then there is no deforestation, the land use practices are sustainable, then we expect the lucid water in the lake to be in a way that we feel it would be said to be sustainable. Lastly, I think the most important thing, again, I want to re-emphasize on that fact of the connectivity between the nexus between sustainable natural resources management, or the landscape, and the water, is that in actual fact, according to FAO, there is an FAO report which says that the combined agriculture, forest, and fisheries, in terms of their value, they account for about 449 billion, which is about 16% of the African GDP. So you can see it is already very important that nexus of the lucid water and lush mountain, that nexus, if you translate it into economic benefits, if they are well managed, then they will contribute to about 16% of Africans' GDP.
Thank you for that detailed explanation. It gave me a lot of clarity there. Professor Zhang, to what extent has this concept of lucid waters and lush mountains been embedded in China's national policies, and how has the green transition shaped the vision of a beautiful China over the recent years?
Thank you. And the concept was included in Xi Jinping's thought on ecological conservation, and it has taken shape and reviewing China's efforts in ecological conservation in the new era. President Xi has introduced a series of creative new ideas, new thinking, and new strategies to address major issues of theoretical and practical importance, such as the kind of ecological progress to be pursued and the ways to achieve it. And this has culminated in the formation of Xi Jinping's thought on ecological conservation. And meanwhile, public awareness and recognition have also grown regarding the need for harmony between humanity and nature. And the notion that lucid waters and the lush mountains are invaluable assets, and the importance of resources conservation, environmental protection, and green development. And how it's taken, I think China makes efforts and gain progress to shape the vision of a beautiful China. So the first is to establish an institutional framework for ecological conservation. And a number of important systems have been put in place. The second is to accelerate the green and low carbon development. And China has become the global leader in installed capacities of hydropower, wind power, and solar power. And the decade from 2012 to 2022 saw a significant rise in the share of clean energy in China's total energy mix, climbing from 14.5% to 25.9%. And this was accompanied by a reduction in the share of coal in primary energy consumption from 68.5% to 56.2%, alongside 40.1% decrease in carbon dioxide emission per unit of GDP. And this is the second measure. And the third one is to promote the ecological protection and the restoration. China has led the way in introducing a system for ecological conservation red lines, which cover over 30% of the country's total land area. Now, in implementing this system, China integrated and refined more than 9,000 nature reserves and established China's first 5 national parks. And the last measure is to make the contribution to global ecological governance. And to cope with the climate change, China has not only worked for the conclusion, signing, entry into force, and implementation of the Paris Agreement, but also made a commitment to reaching peak carbon emissions by 2030 and carbon neutrality by 2060.
Okay, thank you, Professor. I want to know from both of you, what are some of the most pressing ecological challenges facing the world today, and how can policy and community engagement work together to address them efficiently?
Indeed, there are quite a number of challenges we would pick in Africa, which probably some of them might be the same with China. But I'll start saying that in terms of promoting the Lucid water and lush mountain, we require huge investment, especially for restoration in Africa. And one of the challenges we face there is actually the financing gap. In actual fact, the African Development Bank has estimated that to actually restore the various ecosystem in Africa, we will require about $3 trillion by 2030 for actually climate action. Yes, because a lot of these resources that we are talking about in Africa are actually vulnerable to climate change. And therefore, we need to have huge investment in terms of resources. And this is the resources that probably might not be available, and therefore creating a big financing gap. The other challenge I would say about Africa is actually on its dependency on fossil fuel. When we talk of fossil fuel, I want to particularly look at the countries in the north of Africa. Most of them, like Libya, Morocco, we talk of all those, Egypt, most of them are still using fossil fuel. And this is actually posing a great threat, of course, to climate change, which we are also saying, of course, is like a vicious circle. You continue using fossil fuel, then we continue again suffering from the climate change. And then we are saying we have a gap of about 3 trillion to address climate action. So it's really a paradigm, So those countries, that is one of their challenges, because traditionally their economic base has on fossil fuel. So that's a very big challenge, but not to say that there's nothing that is being done to that. Some of the milestones you would look at in terms of promoting renewable energy that would probably try to reduce the dependence on fossil fuel is actually renewable energy. Kenya is quite advanced in terms of promoting renewable energy, because there is a program called Turkana Wind Pipe project, which actually is generating about 310 megawatts, and it actually is regarded as the largest wind power project in Africa. Similar projects are also found in South Africa, and of course there is also geothermal. If you look at a country like Ethiopia is promoting hydropower, which basically it is a renewable, it is a part of renewable energy. But the other challenge I would also want to flag out, other than the dependency on fossil fuel, is actually policy and what we call policy and regulatory barriers. China is almost homogeneous. Most of the policies, they are actually almost talking to each other. But if you come to Africa, most of the policies are not talking to each other. And therefore, the framework upon which we try to promote sustainable development and management of natural resources within the country, that is both on land and in water, are sometimes in variance. And of course, I would not also want to leave out the aspect of climate change. In short, I think in terms of the challenges, those are the challenges that probably I can be able to flag out. But there is one thing that I would want to mention. There's something that is called the Great Green Wall.
Right.
It's sort of like a wall, a buffer to stop the encroachment of the Sahara Desert. It is a green wall. The aim of this particular wall is to restore about 250 million acres of degraded land in the Sahel. You can see the efforts that the continent is doing towards, we address issues of environmental degradations, issues of climate change, and issues of even loose biodiversity loss. So there are quite a number of initiatives that have been.
Professor Zhang?
Firstly, to some extent, I quite agree with Dr. Matano's introduction about the challenges. And in my opinion, the most pressing ecological challenges facing the world today are not only the climate changes, but also the pollution problems and energy transition problems, marine environmental protections. And to solve these problems, I think this is the big question. I think it both needs nation policy support and community efforts. Firstly, the nation should establish the policies to reduce the pollutions, promote energy transmission, and ocean production, and making some measures to raise people's awareness of ecological protection. Secondly, the community member should actively participate in ecological environmental protection. For example, starting from themselves and their surroundings. Maybe in Chinese is 保护环境从我做起，从身边做起。
Thank you. Okay. Would you be able to translate that for us?
It means in order to protect the environment, we should start from ourselves.
Okay.
From our surroundings environment.
So still on you, Professor Zhang. We know China has been promoting green transition globally, including in Africa. In what specific ways is it advancing ecological protection and green development on the continent, on the African continent?
Okay, so since the Beijing summit of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation last September, both sides have made important progress in ecological protection and green development cooperation. And firstly, enhancing practical cooperation on climate change, green development, and in some key areas. From the summit to the end of March 2025, the revenue of the contracted clean energy projects in Africa by Chinese enterprises reached RMB 21.18 billion yuan. And a special fund of China-Africa Green Industrial Chain was funded, and 7 projects with an investment of 6.2 billion yuan have been approved. And support was given to African nations with the implementation of the first batch of programs under Kunming Biodiversity Fund, and China-Africa Green Invoice Program was implemented, uplifting the green skills and knowledges, sharing the sustainable development of both sides. And this is the first cooperation. And second, strengthening cooperation on marine and geology and mineral resources sectors. China has signed cooperation agreements and provided material assistance to countries including Benin, Togo, and Ghana, supporting them to enhancing capabilities of marine observation and monitoring. And the geology officials and experts were invited to China for exchange and visits. And a total of 13 geoscience training programs were held for African countries. And China has signed cooperation documents in earth science with Zambia, South Africa, and other countries. And the last cooperation, I think, maybe is strengthening scientific cooperation.
And just to wind off our discussion, perhaps briefly there, Dr. Matano, can you share some successful examples of China advancing Africa's ecological protection efforts and green transition, and what other opportunities do you see in that space?
Thank you. Indeed, I think we are now currently seeing a shift because previously, the support from China was mainly on infrastructural development. And indeed, I think we needed it, and it was justified.
Right.
We have had massive support of infrastructure development in China. And all this infrastructural development has an impact on the ecosystem. And that is now where the aspect of green development is coming in. And I'm so glad, and I wish to actually, on behalf of my people, my fellows from this side, to really appreciate the support that has been given. And I'm also very happy from what Professor Xian has given us, the initiative that is China is now pushing towards a green transition. I think this is going to be very important. And one of the things that I quickly pick is already there has been a previous initiative in Africa from the Chinese, and closer to me here, for example, there is actually a Chinese Africa Environmental Cooperation Center that is actually domiciled at Nairobi. It might not be very active, but they work very closely with UNEP. I think this will hold a very good position for the China African Environmental Cooperation Center to become even much stronger. Secondly, part of the national resources that Africa is proud about is actually wildlife conservation. And I'm personally aware that there is a wildlife protection and poaching support that is certain countries in Africa are receiving from China. Tanzania is, for example, one of them. There is also support to Botswana and even Zimbabwe in terms of enhancing, building their capacity. Of course, there are a number of ecological restoration and sustainable development agriculture that initiative that also have been supported by China. But most importantly, I want to pick on what Professor Jan has said in terms of research. China has been very instrumental in supporting research institutions within Africa.
Well, that brings us to the end of our discussion there. Professor Jiang and Dr. Matano, thank you so much for your insights and your input on this discussion.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Listeners, you can subscribe to our online newsletter on CGTN or Substack to get more insights on China-Africa relations. Just search China-Africa Talk. For now, it's goodbye. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others. Post it on social media or leave a rating and review. Thanks again. See you next time.